Good afternoon. My name is Bob McMaster, and I'm a faculty member in the Geography Department on occasion, and currently work in the Provost's office. Today, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you to this year's John Borchert Lecture and to introduce this year's speaker, Dr. Carl Steinitz of Harvard University and University College London. Each year, we are fortunate that members of the Borchert family are able to join us for this lecture. Normally, I would have them wave to us, but today I'll mention their names. I'm pleased to acknowledge, I hope they're here in the ether, Bill, Dave, and Pat Borchert. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to be here and to celebrate the memory of John, your father, even if in a virtual format. And I also wanted to welcome Michael and Tom Borchert, who I believe are here as well. John Borchert was a very special colleague of ours in the Geography Department. Believe it or not, this is now the 14th John Borchert Lecture in Geographic Information Science. Our first was in the spring of 2008. Some of our previous speakers at this event have included Jack Dangermont. He was our first John Borchert lecturer. Michael Goodchild, Mark Mominier, Tim Nyergis, David DiBiase, Nina Lamb, Tom Fisher, Vipin Kumar, Jessica Hellman, Don Wright, and Shaowen Wang. When talking about John Borchert, I used to say, as most of you know, but given the changes at the university and our world, I now should say, perhaps say, as some of you know, or even as a few of you know. John Borchert, one of the intellectual fathers of our geography department, had a great love of maps and spatial information. In fact, because of his great interest in cartography and spatial information, our internationally recognized map library was named the John Borchert Map Library in May of 1989. John Borchert was one of the most influential geographers of the 20th century. Educated in geology at DePauw University and having completed a PhD with a focus in climatology from the University of Wisconsin, he turned his keen mind to human settlement patterns and urban geography. A Regents professor and member of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the very first geographers so named, John was a member of the geography faculty for 40 years, from 1949 to 1989, with a career that intellectually spanned the discipline from biophysical geography to urban geography. But his work always maintained a constant focus on the map as the obligatory tool of our profession. It was another influential Minnesota geographer, Yi-Fu Tuan, who wrote, "In a period of intellectual flux, when geography seems tempted to follow non-geographical sirens of transient glamour, John Borchert always managed to anchor the discipline's sense of identity on the rock of cartographic information." Only Yi-Fu Tuan could write something like that. Several of John's last projects focused on the upper Middle West and Minnesota. His seminal book, America's Northern Heartland, an economic and historical geography of the upper Middle West, was published in 1987. And his video series for public TV, Geography of Minnesota, appeared in the early 1990s. I remember well sitting in on John's Minnesota class during the 1990-91 academic year. I could not have had any better preparation for my new life in Minnesota. Thus, John remained very active in research until his retirement and passed away in spring 2001. For those of you who are interested, a John Borchert website was created that documents his career. Just type in borchert.com and you'll find it. In 2008, given his signature contributions to our department and the field of geography, and his great love of geography and maps, the University of Minnesota named this JS lecture series after John. This year, we are absolutely delighted that Dr. Carl Steinitz of Harvard University and University College London has joined us for this terrific lecture. Carl Steinitz is the Alexander and Victoria Wiley Professor of Landscape Architecture and Planning Emeritus at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, an Honorary Professor at the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis, University College London. He began his affiliation with the Harvard Laboratory for Computer Graphics and Spatial Analysis in 1965. In 1967, Professor Steinitz received his PhD degree in city and regional planning with a major focus in urban design from MIT. In 1984, the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture presented Professor Steinitz with the Outstanding Educator Award for his extraordinary contributions to environmental design education and for his pioneering exploration in the use of computer technology in landscape planning. He has been honored as one of Harvard University's outstanding professors. Professor Steinitz is principal author of Alternative Futures for Changing Landscapes, published by Island Press in 2003, and author of A Framework for Geodesign, published by Esri Press in 2012. He has lectured and given workshops at more than 150 universities and has received several honorary degrees. Today, Carl's talking to us on his topic, Rethinking the Growth of London, an interactive, multi-stakeholder perspective derived in geodesign and negotiation. So with that, thank you very much, Carl, for joining us, and you may share your screen now.
Bob, Len, Tom, thank you very much for inviting me to give the Borchert lecture. I know about half, I know well about half of the people who have given this lecture, and I'm delighted to join them in a very substantial group of people who have shaped modern geography and modern, basically in all of its aspects, GIS, science or not, depending on how your outlook is. My talk is, let me begin a different way than with this slide. I taught at Harvard for about 48 years and then moved to London. And for the last dozen, I've been an honorary professor at CASA, at the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis. There we have about 30 or so PhD students and about 20 faculty, about half of whom are senior citizens like me with an awful lot of experience. And there's a large master's program. Most of the people there do research and development on the management of urban environments, social systems, economic systems, shopping systems, and they're mainly big data people who are taking advantage of technology and how it can be analyzed and visualized and understood. And I play a slightly different role. I play a sort of cynical role, and I will several times offer my opinions during this lecture on the benefits of natural language and minimum data, small data. But rather than simplifying big data to be understood by the prime minister or the governor, I'm more interested in taking simple data and making it complexly analytical, using it complexly so that everybody can understand it. And so I sometimes ask very strange questions. And my talk today will be examples of this. There'll be 3 themes of this talk, and then I'm more than happy to answer questions as you see fit. The first one is on geodesign and negotiation. Why geodesign and why negotiation, as opposed to big data analysis and modeling and agent-based modeling? And we can do those things, but that's not what I'm really interested in. The second one is on the International Geodesign Collaboration. Why is it that we can't all speak the same language so that we can collaborate globally? And what are we doing about it? And the third is one example of many examples that I could show by myself with colleagues, by other people that I've had nothing to do with, that take this sort of geodesign attitude and the idea that we need to be able to understand each other's work without special jargon, special lexicons, and even special legends. And it's a big project. It's a big political project, and I'm going to use that as a case study, although I could offer many others. There's a subtext to this lecture. The subtext is on the merits of applying minimal relevant data. Minimal relevant data. In other words, I don't collect data at the beginning, and I certainly don't say, here's a database, let's see what I can do with it. I have a problem that I want to attack. And because of the problem and the nature of what I think I know, and my colleagues working with me think we know about the problem, we know what we're looking for, and then we want to find it. But there are also questions of time relevance and scale relevance and detail relevance. And I don't want the finest detail. I don't want decimal points. I want categories that are likely to be right for a long, long time, because I'm looking 30 years ahead. And I want to use natural language. I don't want to use GI science language or computer jargon. I want to use the ordinary language of the ordinary people of the ordinary places that I'm working with, because they're part of the process. And if they don't understand it, my analysis is not going to be implemented in policies and projects. I'm also interested in seeking strategic solutions. Strategic means broad brush. When you look and make a plan for the future, it's not to know that Mr. Jones's property is going to be changed. It's that something like this, somewhere around here and somewhere at this time, more or less, is likely to happen or should happen or could happen. So precision is not what I'm after. I'm after interrelated strategies to a complex problem. Almost everybody that I've worked with in the last dozen years or listened to, almost everybody, focus on one system, the management of the metro, or shopping performance in poor areas, or where should the next hospital for tuberculosis be in London. But I don't think that's how the world works. I think it works with multiple systems interacting with each other. So it's a complex problem. It's not a one system problem. It's a multi-system problem. And it's relatively unpredictable because it's for the future. And the people who are going to live there in the future may be dead now in the next days. In other words, the people that we're working for are not necessarily the people we're working with. And that's a class of problem. It's a very important class of problem. Because when the fundamental conditions change in the future, or the models which we're now working at all over the place predict future problems, in other words, if the model is a good model, but it predicts a future problem, the answer is not in the model. The answer may be something not in the model and not in the data. And the end game of our work usually requires a purposely designed plan for future action. What should we do now for the future? Should we buy school sites in advance? Do we build a dam for the water supply that we don't have now, which takes 20 years to fill? Those are huge questions. And these are normally and necessarily political processes. So if the prime minister doesn't understand it, the governor doesn't understand it, the president surely doesn't understand it, we've got a problem. So what's the generic problem? The generic problem is how do we organize and conduct the very beginning and strategic stages of designing for longer term change in a large, multi-system, multi-client, relatively unpredictable and contentious context. And one which should not become a zero-sum game, because if it does become a zero-sum game, everybody will be in the law courts and it'll stop for 20 years before anything gets done. And this is frequently the situation for important and complex projects and studies. Now, let's give an example. In 1883, Horace Cleveland came to Minneapolis from Boston, where he was a well-known landscape architect. And he was, at that point, this is, by the way, a map of Minneapolis from that period, when Minneapolis had a population of about 50,000 people, and St. Paul was a ways a little bit. And what he did was he drove, probably on a horse more than likely, or a carriage, all over the place. And he said, these are the places that we should make boulevards, and these are the lakes that we should control as public parks. And he basically bought, on behalf of the body politic, the foundation of a city's park system where the city wasn't there yet. I don't know how many people went to these places as parks in 1883, but in 1920, they surely did. And this is what that park system is like now for Minneapolis and basically linking into St. Paul. Except now, in the region at least, there are 3 million people. I'm making that number up, but I think I'm close. And it leaves a very, very interesting question. How do you organize the very beginning and strategic changes of designing for longer-term change, etc., in Minneapolis, when you've got 3 million now, and by 2050, you may well have 5 million, if not more, because you're a favored place in the global changes which are happening under our feet. So if Minneapolis wanted to, as a region, wanted to now think about where the park system should be, or the school system should be, or the sewage system should be, maybe it ought to think about where the housing should be now and control the land like Horace Cleveland did in 1883, so it benefits people by the time they get there. And that's a geodesign problem. No model is going to solve that problem. There'll be analysis, but the design won't come from the data. Geodesign changes geography by design. And by what I mean by design is in the verb, not the noun definition of the word. By design means purposeful change. Not the product, but the process of making purposeful change. Geodesign applies systems thinking to the creation of proposals for change and their impact simulations informed by their geographic contexts, and usually, but not necessarily, in my opinion, supported by digital technology. In other words, I'm approaching what you call geodesign science as a designer who understands it and who's done it for 60 years in a digital environment. 60 years. Geodesign is an invented word in the 90s by 3 people in Europe who didn't know each other, and a very useful term to describe a collaborative activity that is not, I mention it, not the exclusive territory of any design profession, geographic science, or information technology. Each participant in the collaboration must know and be able to contribute something that the others cannot or do not. Yet during the process, no one need lose his or her professional, scientific, or personal identity. Geodesign is serious, and it mainly operates now in these middle 3 of my diagram that I use all the time on the top. It's not that much used by designing a house, although it could be, and it has, and it's not yet used enough working at global issues, but we're working on that. Geodesign is serious. There are important problems, and frequently there's little time for decision and action. People and groups have different interests and priorities. Each needs legitimacy via design. Geodesign does not normally produce a final product. It is likely to be most useful at the beginning of thinking about and deciding on the strategy of what to do. Geodesign is complex. There are uncertainties. There are multiple geographic scopes, political boundaries, watersheds, etc. There's complex content, systems which vary by size, location, threat. The change requirements are many. Geodesign methods do not scale, and they do not repeat exactly. They should fit the context. Actually, the methods should be designed to fit the context. Therefore, geodesign and its technical support must be flexible, iterative, rapid, transparent, and rapid. Geodesign is dynamic. Change in a design is a relational synthesis among systems, a relational synthesis in space and time of sets of system-based policies and projects. It doesn't come whole. It comes as an emerging process. And the sequence matters. What goes first governs what goes second. And if you reverse first and second, the design will turn out to be different. Design should be assessed and iteratively improved, knowing that any change changes all the systems. We've experimented. We know that the first design is never the best design. Usually the fourth, fifth might be. Therefore, a primary aim of geodesign is to rapidly move from infinite possible designs toward a socially, environmentally, and economically feasible one. The geodesign endgame must support informed negotiation. Geodesign is collaborative, more than likely. Geodesign is likely to be collaborative. Therefore, all aspects of geodesign support must be easily learned, easily used, and most important, easily communicated. And the language of geodesign must be easily understood by all. Geodesign is a collaborative social political process of design. The design will emerge. In this diagram, I'm basically arguing that if you're designing for the globe, it's basically people who don't agree with each other. Those are my little round dot colors. They're either countries that don't agree, or they're even scientists who don't agree. But they're going to focus on defensive strategies of what's important and what should be protected. These international conferences do that. And they have to find a way to collaborate and negotiate. At the opposite side, designing a house or selecting a house or buying a house or renting a house, these could be the members of a family. The teenagers and the babies and the parents and the grandparents, they don't necessarily agree. And the architect and the client may not agree, or you have several people you're consulting, and they also have to negotiate. But they're doing it on the basis of not supply and defense, but on demand and offense, because they want to change things. And these three kind of projects in the middle, these big, big, complicated projects, they have the special problem of having to relate to all of these, the sciences, the design professions, the information technologists, and most importantly, the people of the place, who are in some ways like each other and in some ways very different from each other. And I've worked in those kind of middle-sized, big projects for a very, very long time. And I've written about the framework that I use to organize my teaching and my various research projects, and on occasional consulting. I've done it for 30 or 40 years. But in 2012, after many discussions with Jack Dangermond, he finally said to me, you got to do this book. And so I did it. And I basically wrote a book based on my lecture notes in my Theories and Methods course, which I taught for many years at Harvard. And I wrote it based on my lecture notes and my slides in a couple of months. And it basically is a framework that has 6 questions and 3 phases. The 6 questions are, how should the landscape, the context, whatever the context is, how do you describe it? And these are representation models. Most of us call that data. The second question is, how does it work? And these are process models. And most of us call it knowledge. The third question, is it working well? And these are what we would call evaluation models. And most of us understand fully that that varies and it's a function of our values. Well, what does it mean? Good, bad, healthy, unhealthy? These are values. They vary globally. You may have some, but not necessarily your neighbor. Then the fourth question, how might the context be changed? These are change models. And interestingly enough, those are data, and all we're doing in making a design is changing the data. The fifth question, what differences might the changes cause? These are impact models. And all we're doing is running the process models, the knowledge, under new data. And we're comparing before and after. And finally, what should we do? How should it be changed? And these are decision models, and these are based on the values. And we're comparing what is being proposed in our values to what we have now or had in the past to our values. And these 6 questions operate regardless of what you're trying to accomplish in a design or in a plan, in a change. And if you believe that the landscape and the context are going to change in the future and dramatically, you have to deal with these 6 questions. Analysis doesn't get you to the answer, what should we do? It's a collaborative process. And it involves color codes. If you look at the upper left-hand corner, this is the cover of my book, and my lecture is color-coded. Anytime you see purple, it's the people of the place. Anytime you see orange, it's design professions. Blue is the scientists. Green is the information technologies. And in a collaborative project, where the client group, the people you're working with, the sciences, the information people, the planning architect, landscape architect, engineer, banker, lawyer people who are designers, you have no idea. I'm sorry. You have no idea where the ideas are going to come from. You have no idea where they're going to come from, but they're going to come in the 3 phases. The first phase is to understand the process, which goes from where are we? What's going on? Are there problems? What are you thinking about? What are the important issues? To how you specify the methods. How do we actually, in a digital or non-digital, let's call it digital world, how do we model, meaning organize our understanding of these processes? And finally, the what, where, when questions, which we have to do. We have to organize data. We have to build our process models. We have to evaluate. We have to propose change. We have to assess and compare options. We have to decide. And 3 things will happen: no, maybe, and yes. No means feedback, and it could feedback anywhere. We need more data. We need to reevaluate. We need to redesign. We need to mitigate. We need to educate. Or yes, you've done a perfect job. Take it to these people, and they, not you, they review and decide. Or maybe, and you have to change scale. And there's a workflow involved where different people do different things. But I'm going to concentrate in my talk on making the design itself and how that operates. And finally, and most importantly, even though I present a framework in a linear process, by the way, as a bunch of questions, not as a bunch of answers, it's never linear in application. The reason you need a framework to organize yourself is 2. There are 2 of them. One of them is so that people know what to expect and when from whom, because it's a collaborative process and everybody doesn't do everything. The second is when you've made a mistake, and you do on almost every project, you know where you are, you know you can go back, and you can go forward again. So the generic problem is an important one, but what is the real problem? What is the real problem? And I think this is the real problem. In the upper left diagram, in red, is the global territory which is human dominated, either by development for agriculture or housing or industry. On the lower left is a forecast for the year 2050 of water scarcity. And when it's brown, it's water scarcity all year round. On the lower right, by 2050, with a 3 degrees Celsius change in climate temperature, change in expected crop yields ranging in red from loss of 50% to the possibility of growth in the northern climates. And what's most important is the upper right, which comes from the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, which forecasts in the areas in red the prospect of 1.5 billion people wanting to migrate. Why? because they don't have water and they can't grow food. That is the problem that this generation of students will have to be dealing with. And these problems compound themselves when you look at it globally, as the World Bank does, let alone nationally, let alone locally. And these studies are out there. They're in the literature. And by the way, Minneapolis has a favored position, a very favored situation. Your problems are what my partner Tess calls luxury problems. Luxury problems compared to the central belt of the equatorial land, which is impossible. Now, a couple of years ago, we started to talk in geodesign at the annual meeting that was held in Esri, and Tom Fisher and Brian Orland and I decided in 2018 to organize an international collaboration on geodesign, looking at large, serious, long-term problems. And we did this by word of mouth. We really did it by word of mouth. And we started in February 2018, and within 3 months, we had 90 universities. We now have more than 160, with teams in a little bit more than 50 countries. And we have 96 completed studies. And they're all with very interesting similarities and very interesting differences. We made an agreement that to join this, and by the way, it's a volunteer organization, and we welcome any university in the world and any NGO in the world to join us. We want it to be non-governmental, although many of our universities are state universities. We agreed on 4 things. Number 1, a project would include 8 required systems and 2 that were locally decided. The 8 are water, agriculture, green infrastructure, energy, transport, industry and commerce, institutions, including military, and residents. And they could be subdivided, but every map is using the same color code.
Secondly,
every site that we study is going to be a square. That's actually important. It means that every political area that wants to be studied has to study what's on the other side of its boundary. And besides which, we're thinking globally, so we can match squares, we can put them together. Every study is going to be based on 3 scenarios and 2 reporting time areas, 2020, 2035, and 2050. And the 3 scenarios, the first one is we think ahead and we adopt innovations now. We don't do what we've been doing in the past. Scenario B is the late adopters. We wait a while. We wait 15 years and we see what the rest of the world is doing to adapt. And then we do things, but we do these things not as the lead people, but 15 years later when there's experience. But we don't do everything because we started late. And the third scenario is we don't do any innovation at all. We basically take what we're doing now and we carry it forward. We're happy now or we're unhappy now, but we carry things forward to the year 2050 as they are now. It's in a sense the null hypothesis. So it's a very experimental pursuit. And all of the designs are to be assessed, whether by models or by expert judgment or by crowdsourcing, by the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, of which most of the countries of the world are signers to. So the collaboration did a bunch of research, mainly headed by Alan Shearer at the University of Texas, on global assumptions that underlie the work that we're looking. Why are we looking to 2050? Because population will grow, it'll grow older, it'll concentrate in areas that are urban, the global economy will double, there'll be a transformation of energy, transportation will be substantially automated, the built environment will be networked and smarter, global temperatures will rise, regions will face increased climate variability, Sea level will rise. Freshwater scarcity will become more prevalent. Food production's pressures will increase. Pollution concerns will identify, and migration will increase. And for every one of these, there's a research group, there's a PowerPoint, they're all downloadable from the website, and there's a whole body of research and citations for this. Then the members created committees. We created committees for each of the systems, and a group of people researched the internet and their colleagues, and we identified 150 systems innovations which are out there in the world already being tested and in research that we expected by 2035 and by 2050. And so the early adopters have 150 things plus others that they can say, well, maybe we should try this here. Maybe we should try this here. Let's see what happens if we try this here. And so the designs, at least of the early adopter scenario, can take as many of these as they think they want to in their area and see whether they have an influence on the design. Now, sometimes a study has more than one team for each of these, and so they need to negotiate toward one design, which can be assessed by the SDGs, by the Sustainable Development Goals. But sometimes you want one plan coming out of it. So the three alternative scenarios need to negotiate to say, well, wait a minute, maybe the early adopters is too radical for us. Maybe the late one picked the wrong things to be late on. Maybe the non-adopter is a good one because we don't have any money in our budget because we've spent it all on protecting ourselves from the virus. Those are real issues and they'll change. So the negotiation doesn't start, the final design doesn't start a priori. It starts by different alternatives and discussing them and negotiating them. And we need software that does it, helps you do that, and we have it. We all agreed on the same format. There are the three scenarios. That's the United Emirates growing the largest interior city in the desert. And there's Tom Fisher and his team at the University of Minnesota looking at the central part of Minnesota, St. Paul and Minneapolis. It's in exactly the same color code, except one is a desert and one is central Minneapolis. And we published a book that shows and compares the first 50 projects. We've got 50 of them in the first book. And we found some things that were interesting. These are the two really interesting things of many, but two. One is some systems were more prominent in the designs than others. Green infrastructure, water, housing, and energy. And that's because these are popular today. But in point of fact, agriculture will be one of the most important ones in the long term. And finally, when you looked at the relative importance of these systems, this is a color-coded thing, and I should have a color code. Well, I do. This is color-coded. There's the color code. What you found was variance in the role of systems inclusion by macro geography and general level of economic development. In other words, if you were a poor area, employment or food and water might be more important. If you're a rich area and a cool area, mixed use development might be more important, and raising densities because your cities are growing. So this idea that one set of global solutions will fit the globe, that's crazy. It won't work. So what you need is some global languages, but local, regional, and national designs. And that means variability in models, not general models that are used all over the place. Because the value of these models is going to be, the values that are embedded in them are going to be different. And now I'm going to show you one case of many, many. This is a case that was organized by me with the help of Mike Batty and Richard Milton at CASA. This is a real hot issue. It's a very real proposal that was publicly announced by the Minister of Transportation and the Prime Minister about a year and a half ago. And we decided that this, as a proposal, had to be second guessed. So we just decided to do it. This is the corridor which links Cambridge and Oxford. And England has a National Infrastructure Commission, it has as its brief the advice to the government on long-range infrastructure planning. Now, the NIC proposed to add 1.5 million people and 780,000 housing units to the existing population of around 3 million people, and a new major highway, because the highways there are old traditional highways, and a reestablished train link linking Oxford and Cambridge. And that's a big problem. It's, by the way, a big problem to the extent of about 200 to 300 billion pounds. Translated into dollars and you'll be close. However, there are some very interesting problems. One of them is the knowledge-intensive locations are not on the train line. And therefore, you've got a real problem because the pattern of development is small towns and small industrial zones. And so you have what the GI scientists would call the first mile and last mile problem. So to get by train to a place not on the train, you need 3 vehicles. You need a train, but you need a bus or a car or a bicycle or walking or whatever to get to where you actually want to go. So that's a problem. So investing in a train is a very complicated problem, especially since the link between Bedford and Cambridge, when the train went out of business years ago, was sold, and it's now private property. Whereas there is a train from Bedford to Oxford. The second problem, nobody really goes in big numbers from Cambridge to Oxford. This is the connectivity, daily commuting. There's huge commuting to London. It's terrible from Cambridge and from Oxford. They stand on the train all the time. But the real commuting is if you teach at Oxford or work in Oxford, you work near Oxford. If you work in Milton Keynes, you live near Milton Keynes. If you work near Cambridge, you live near Cambridge. But if you work in London, you have to get there. So you have to wonder. You have to wonder about the priorities. These are the real problems where the money needs to be invested. The local traffic. And finally, this problem. Both Cambridge and Oxford, and especially London, have green belts. And the real crisis in London is the cost of housing. And there are over 300 projects for housing development and mixed-use development on the books and proposed in the green belt. And if the green belt legislation were weakened, which there's enormous pressure to do and enormous pressure not to do, the whole investment project for this Oxford-Cambridge would be highly questioned because it's a lot easier to get to London from one of these purple dots. And I hope these never happen because I think the green belt is a good idea. But it could easily. So this is the problem. And it's not a one system problem. It's a multi-system problem and it's a design problem. We're using a piece of software developed in its first iteration at CASA by Rishi Balal years ago. Rishi is a brilliant engineer, and he runs a one-man company called geodesignhub.com. This software has been used by me many times, and it's been used a couple of hundred times on projects, not necessarily as big as mine, but on very important negotiation type projects. It basically embeds the workflow that I wrote about in my framework book, and it's integratable with almost any computer software in any language. It manages the workflow. It has no models, it has no data, it has no suggestions, but it has tools that allow you to build them in a very simple manner, but you can also import them as complicated as you like. And it's a brilliant piece of software. You can't buy it, you can rent it. And it works very elegantly because it works for people who have no technical background. Every piece of it is dynamic and capable of being changed on the fly. Every piece of it. There's a YouTube video by me showing the dynamics of design. Basically, it has to, because any piece of it needs to be able to be changed during feedback. It requires inputs. It needs a decision model in which you rank order the importance of the different systems which you're working with. And the whole system will revert to your decision model in the ordering of things. It needs a study area, and the area should be a square, although it doesn't have to be. It needs you to estimate how much change in area you want for each of your systems. In this case, agriculture is going to be the largest new land use.
It needs for evaluation, and I use a 5-level language.
Thing that's in red, it means it's existing, working well, and leave it alone. If you see it in orange, it means it's not appropriate for that land use. Then there's light green, which is capable to have a house built on it. Darker green, which is suitable to build a house on it because it has utilities, it has a road, it has water. And feasible means there's a market for it. And so all the evaluation models for all of the systems are in the same graphic language, and therefore they can be overlain as maps, not as data. It needs a very simple set of systems impact and cross systems impact. What this does, this little chart says, if I put transportation on an inappropriate site, it'll be either orange or yellow or darker orange, which is the worst, but it also creates opportunity cost for other uses. For example, I wouldn't likely put a industry on top of a highway. It could be done, but it wouldn't normally be done. And you need a cost model. And a cost model could be high, medium, and low. It could be $50,000 per square acre. And you can set the cost of different projects. It takes these scenarios, and these are the innovations which from the 150 were considered to be important for the landscape of England in suburban London. And they're not in order. They're not in any special order. They're in the alphabetical order that we have in the computer. The first one is increased protection of historic places and landscape. The less historic landscape and important landscape you have in the future, the more you're going to protect what you still have. The second one is robotic agriculture, carbon farming, controlled environment agriculture. When the climate changes in Middle England, we're going to be able to grow the things the Dutch grow now, and we're going to do it under controlled environment because the water problems will be there. Water retention will be extremely important. It has to be a resilient, connected landscape. It has to be based on renewable energy. It has to be based on self-driving cars, which will disrupt the train industry because the cars will be able to link into trains and will be able to go at roughly 100 miles an hour as trains, but on roads, which means they can peel off to the towns and villages and industries which are not on the train line. Industry will be heavily robotic. It'll be basically with rapid prototyping, and rapid prototyping means internet-based distribution. It means you go to the store to look at something and to feel it, but you don't necessarily do it to buy because they're going to make it to fit you by robotics. It'll require sustainable urban infrastructure for the urban systems, water, sewer, transport, internet, air conditioning, heating maybe. And the National Commission, they ran a competition for what should this Camp Cox corridor be like. And they had 4,
picked 2 others, and they were really very, very professional, serious planning firms.
Basically in England, but from all over the United Kingdom. There were
submissions. And I took
4 of these. I took 4 of them that I thought had done well. The 3 of them are winners of the commission, of the competition. And I looked at their overall designs, which are diagrammatic. If you look at them, they're diagrams. They're not precise. I know that some of them are GIS based, but the presentation is not GIS based.
What I did is I decomposed them. I took their ideas and I put projects. So when you see each column of diagrams, it's color coded. You can see the first one is institutions, the second is history, third is when you see a solid form, it means it's a project. Excuse me, it's a project. If you have them, it means it's a policy. A project is something that gets built. It's a physics. A policy is like a law or a guideline. It guides a project. And so I ended up from the competition probably 70 or 80 diagrams. And then we invited people. And the people who we invited, Mike Batty organized this for us. These are people that are not from government. Some of them are actually. But these are the sort of research and advisory class. They're university people who specialize in urban growth, urban change, ecological change, systems change, and many of them from Cambridge and Oxford and universities. And then these are people who are from the area. So these are sort of the consulting class, not the government class. By the way, we invited the people from the commission and they chose not to come. I can't help that. I'll talk about that later in a question. And we decided to do this in a 2-day workshop. We're going to do the entire study I'm going to show you in 2 days. By the way, they were 2 consecutive days. If I did this now, I would do it spread over a week in 3 sessions, but we did it in 2 consecutive days. So these are serious people taking serious time. So there we are, we're meeting at a room at UCL, and there's me explaining in the first day, introduction to the workshop at 10 o'clock. This is Rishi, whose software we're using, and he's explaining the data structure. And these are the people on their laptops. And by the way, we do this remotely this year I've done workshops remotely, where everybody's in a different place. It works. And so these are people beginning on their laptops. And the structure is we had about almost 26 people. We had 2 teams for early adoption, 2 teams for non-adopters, for late adopters, and 2 teams for non-adopters. And we were going to make one design coming out of it by negotiation between the teams and then among the teams. The early adopters assume that the team is looking forward to 2050 and planning now for innovations that are forecast to be available by that time. But it has to present a plan that is for 2035 and one for 2050. But they have an interesting problem. Do they think ahead and work backwards, or do they think first for 2035 and then for 2050? And they chose to think first for 2035 and then for 2050. They could have done it backwards. The late adopters, they assume that for any set of reasons, such as financial ability, social competition, political conservatism, that the likelihood of adopting innovations is unlikely or infeasible between now and 2035. Therefore, what they're going to do is go forward to 2035 based on current policies and projects. And then they're going to look at what the early team did and adopt one of the early designs and build some of those projects in their second stage. The non-adopters are going to carry forward to 2035 and continue to carry forward without major innovation to 2050. This is highly unlikely, but we wanted it as a null hypothesis in this experimental mode that we're working in. Now, the group at CASA, me, Richard Kingston, Mike Batty, a couple of other people, we figured out the context, we defined the models, we specified the methods, and we made the data, we made the first process models, and we made the first evaluation models. The workshop started with the data that I had prepared with Richard and Rishi Balal at this point in the framework. And Rishi and I and Tess taught the group that assembled. The first thing they did was they made a design. And we decided by definition that it wasn't good enough. And so we decided, change the design after you evaluated it for its impacts, and change scale for part of it if you needed to. And that would be a repeating process until you decide you're good enough or time runs out, and that's going to be your design for 2035. And many teams did more than one iteration. One team did 4 iterations, each time improving its design. Then we updated the data, which updated the process models and updated the evaluation models based on 2035. And then we said, now make a design for 2050. And by definition, it's not good enough. And you've got to do it again and again and again. And that's your 2050 design. And then you're going to take the other design team's work that's doing exactly what you're trying to do. And you're negotiating with them and the other designs, and then you're going to present it to some group. But actually, we didn't have that group. It was us. And all the teams have the same requirements, which were derived from the work done by the National Infrastructure Commission. And the main issue is housing. So there they are on the day one. They're making their designs using diagrams. And there are the things. Each of these designs has attributes. And to put it into a design, all you do is press this button. And if it's black, it's in the design. And there are the designs. There are the decision models. There are the designs. There's the program. There's the impacts. There's the cost. And by the beginning of day 2, we had 6 designs for 2035 and for 2050. We had them. It took 1 day. Actually, it took about 6 hours. And at the morning of the second day, each team presented its design, and then we did a sociogram that compared the designs. And then they negotiated in pairs. And these are the designs. I'm now going to show you the designs that came out. This is 2030. This is 2020. This is the existing. This is the early adopters. These are the policies that they chose and when. And each of these hatched things is a set of policies. The most important one is this one, this green one, which says protect this land, but let each of the major cities have an area to grow. One direction, because this is a huge tourist area. The tourist area for London is between Cambridge and Oxford. So this is their 2035 plan. This group, the early adopters, has said, we are not going to continue the train. This is the train. There's no train here because we're going to have an automated set of roads by 2035 that let cars that you can call up and not necessarily even own become trains on a road. So we're not going to build the continuation of the road that the National Infrastructure Commission wants. And we're also not going to build any more single-family housing on the ground, except in one location where we're holding land. We also know that there's no plan now to link the high-speed train with this area. So we're going to propose and hold for high-density development. We're going to hold land for a new train station by 2035 that isn't being planned now, because this is going to be a central place by 2050. And this is its plan by 2050, where this becomes a major, major interchange between an existing road, a train road for cars, a high-speed train that will probably continue all the way into Europe. And what's very important is that this becomes a new national park with an expansion zone for each train. And this area becomes changed from field agriculture to major, major greenhouse agriculture, because England, now independent out of Europe, is going to find the need to grow the things that the Dutch grow now, and they'll be able to grow it because climate will have gotten better, but water will have gotten scarcer. So it's going to be a conversion of the English landscape to greenhouses, we think. This is the late adopters. The late adopters continue with single-family housing. You can call them new towns, you can call them what you will, but basically large subdivision areas. They're planned, but they're not on the major transportation routes. So there's some very important problem. This fits the market, but it's not necessarily innovative. And they do build the train. There it is. There's the new, I'm sorry. There's the new right-of-way, the favored one that the National Commission wants. And the road, by the way, is the favored commission's road. I'm sorry. I want to go back. This is 2035. And what they do by 2050 is expand it. Build it, expand it with some more high-density housing. But after 2050, they think this is going to be a new center. And this is the non-adopter. The non-adopter basically continues with single-family housing, and it basically destroys much of the ability to protect some of this landscape and actually keep it in very valuable agriculture. This, by the way, does keep the green belt, but the green belt makes this highly suspect. So these are the three designs, and these were made in 6 hours. Later, we compared them for their SDGs, for the Sustainable Development Goal. And it's very clear that the early adopter ones perform better, but they require innovation. The worst behaving one is continuing what is being done now, part of which is not enforcing rules which exist now. So what happened then is the next stage on day 2. At 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the afternoon, after showing each other and comparing these, they negotiated, and it took about 1.5 hours to come up with a single design. And it was done in public. These are the policies and projects. They were heavily influenced by the early adoption team. I'm sorry, I wanted to go back. And this is the final design that came out of the negotiations. What you see here is the improvement of the train, not from Oxford to Cambridge, but from Oxford to London, from Cambridge to London, and from the Midlands to London, and relying on automated automobiles or pods to link, and Zoom to link Oxford and Cambridge, which is much easier, heavily influenced by higher density housing, and with a major new center at the interchange of the road system and the train system and the international trains and high-speed trains heading for the north. That's a cost estimate, a rough cost estimate of almost 3 billion pounds and 30 years to commence. Every one of these projects has a timeline. It's part of what Geodesign Hub, it keeps track. And if you know the unit costs, what you're seeing in the budget over a 30-year period is less money being spent than an enormous public expenditure. This is the public expenditure. And then an enormous private expenditure, which comes in later and then peters out. In other words, to do this is not cheap. It's a land management problem, an infrastructure problem, a regulatory problem, and it's a market change problem. So this is the work of a 2-day workshop, prepared for in a couple of days, but scheduled so people would be able to come in a couple of months. We're doing this all over the world. Sometimes it's bigger than what I've done in this case study. Sometimes it's smaller, sometimes it's more urban, sometimes it's more regional. The collaboration is seriously tooling up for global scale work. So for example, supposing this was Minnesota, supposing it was Minnesota, and supposing Tom Fisher in his research group is going to study the root district of Minneapolis. And supposing that was part of a study looking at 2050 for the region of Minneapolis. And supposing that that was a study for the governor looking at Minnesota in 2050 for the state of Minnesota. And what would that mean to a study of the United States? And what would that mean to a global study? We're now actually thinking seriously about tooling up in the next year so that the collaboration does exactly that. It actually starts thinking multiple scale for any of our projects and seeing how they, at the same time, are studied at different scale, say by the University of Minnesota or by the Minnesota University system. Because England is now doing this nationally and Slovenia is now doing this nationally. And we're thinking that maybe more of us. I might also say something else. A couple of us believe that we need 10,000 people in the next 5 to 10 years to be able to think in this way. And those are going to be the students who are in graduate school now when some of them consult and when some of them become faculty members. It's not likely to be done unless many more schools take on serious long-term studies. But if they don't take on serious long-term studies, the obsolescence that their current students face learning current modeling methods will be increasingly short. So that's the end of my talk, and I'm more than happy to be open to questions.
I was interested in a project where there were decision makers involved.
Tom, I expected a couple of different kinds of questions, and I guess that's something I'm frequently asked. So let me give you. I'll give you 3 examples. I've had many workshops which have been organized by universities for real governmental client groups, and I've actually done this with client groups who are not professional or governmental, but with villagers. Mulrani, they're on the YouTube. Let me give you 3 examples. I've prepared 3 slides that give you examples. This was a study that was organized by Chico Oliveira, and others at the University of Santa Catarina early this year. This is a study that was done at the South American Geodesign Conference. Ana Clara helped me teach it, and Brian Orland helped me teach it. This is this is in southern Brazil. The people on the stage, the orange people, are state environmental minister people who are the people who coordinate the government with the indigenous, let's call it the indigenous people. It's operated as a tribe. It has a serious leadership. And they have a territory like a Native American reservation. And the man speaking is the headman of the tribe, and these are two of his assistants. And there's a distrust. There's a distrust between these people who are near the capital city of Florianopolis, because years ago a dam was built which flooded all their agricultural land. And the government is now trying to get good relations with them and make a master plan for their future. And so the university organized a workshop for academics who are geographers, geodesign people. They're all over the world, but these are the South Americans, in which a master plan for this tribe, working with the tribe and the government by negotiation, would be the product in a very quick workshop, a workshop that was done in one day, actually. And it was prepared. And here is the discussion of what the issue is. We had two simultaneous groups working, two different teams. And this is the negotiation in which the tribal leader was sitting right up front. Anna Clara did the workshop, the negotiation. I ran the workshop with her, and she ran the negotiation in Portuguese. I don't speak Portuguese, but my framework book is in Portuguese, and the software is in every language. And up front here, the computer people are working, but it's the students and faculty who are suggesting things to the tribe and to the government people, and the tribe says yes or no. And so they basically showed them the designs made in the workshop, and they said no to those designs. And so we rebuilt the design in the negotiation tools, which are totally flexible. And any diagram can be said immediately yes or no into the design. And so we reconstructed the design based on the government people and mainly the tribal people seeing the proposals and saying no and yes to them. And so this is a reconstructed design made on the fly in about 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. And they decided to leave the dam, not make it bigger, not tear it down, but change where the agriculture, make new agricultural land and new housing land and a new reforest area for forest products, and to actually rebuild areas. And they had various forest management policies. They certainly were not going to allow anybody to come out and burn out their forest. And this is the territory of their area, some of which is outside the area where the dam is, where they had to take control of it. And that was a very important thing. They were very happy. The government people were happy, but most important, the tribe people were happy. They'd never been treated this way before. They never had the ability to make their own plan before. That's project number one. I'll show you the next one. Why can't I, wait a minute, why can't I, wait, go back. The second one was organized by the Georgia Coastal Commission, by Lupita McAllen and her staff, working with Rosanna Rivera, Allison Smith, Rishi Bilal, Brian Orland, and a bunch of colleagues from the University of Georgia. This commission is responsible for the coastal zone, which is 10 counties of the state of Georgia, who, with a Republican government, decided that by law or public policy, the commission was not allowed to discuss climate change. But I could discuss climate change, and so we did a project that was off the record. We organized a workshop in which the 9 counties, 9 were represented, each sent somebody, mainly the planner or the mayor or the head of the Chamber of Commerce, or more than one person. She's the mayor, I know, of Liberty, of the town in Liberty. And we taught a team of academic faculty and local people, responsible people, mayors and planning chiefs, a workshop in which each county made its own plan. This is terribly important. Each county has to make its own plan. And they have to negotiate that plan with the neighboring counties and then with the regional commission. She is the regional commissioner. And so each team had to negotiate with its neighbors and negotiate with the regional commission. And then the software allowed us to mosaic the county plans and negotiate with two teams which were making regional plans from the top down. And it took us almost half a day to negotiate a final design. And this is the final design. And it's a negotiation between two regional alternatives and 10 county plans. And it's a forecast on where new development will go. And it reestablishes in blue the areas that NOAA predicts will be destroyed from sea rise and hurricane churn when the waves come in from the east. And the hurricanes are now moving up to South Carolina and Georgia rather than Florida. So this is going to happen. We asked, Brian Orland estimates that 100,000 people will have to be relocated from Georgia's coastal zone. It's a real problem. And why the hell does the governor say you're not allowed to do this? That's criminal, actually. This is the third study. This is a study that Rishi and I were asked to do by the city of Sydney, Australia, organized by the University of New South Wales. The city of Sydney is growing extremely fast and does not want to expand its footprint. This area called Botany Bay, this is Botany Bay. This is where Cook came and discovered the Aboriginals, the other people who lived there. But it's called Discovery, Botany Bay. This is the oldest suburban area of Sydney, Australia, and it's totally built up. That's the port, which is moving north, and that's the airport, which is moving west. The area here is supposed to double in population, meaning double in density by the year 2050. The people in this workshop are all public agency professionals from the different government agencies responsible for planning and management of Sydney and representatives of the two municipalities. In other words, this is not academic. There are faculty members in it, but this is the people who are actually deciding. They made 6 designs. Again, a 2-day workshop. They negotiated a final design, and they visualized it in plan, in impact, in animation, and in 3D. This is doubling the university. This is doubling the hospital. This is a new metro system. This is new higher density housing with commerce associated with it. And this is increasing the density of existing building areas, allowing people to build more on their houses. And it's a completely rebuilt green infrastructure and main roads, because the beaches, the famous beaches of Sydney, are polluted. They have to replace all the storm sewers, and they have to replace climate-controlled water, better water systems. This is what Roderick Simpson said. This is he's professor of planning at the University of Sydney, and he's the Environment Commission for Sydney. He basically said the geodesign approach is most effective in dealing with complexity and emergence of the city. That's an approach that's gaining currency at Greater City Commission. Place-based planning allows a wide range of factors to be considered concurrently by reducing the scale but not the scope. It allows contextually specific response, which geodesign supports. The selection process and the negotiation in the geodesign process could be considered a form of emergence. It's true. It's a bottoms-up creation of a city, particularly if emergence is seen to be a pattern of an idea gaining provenance. It's through the negotiation process of design, basically, and consensus, which is where the geodesign process adds significant value. He said that after he saw what was going on in the negotiation process. He was just amazed by it. And they're now doing other studies for the airport area and for the city at the university. Okay, so that's my answer to the question, Tom. What are the barriers to implementing geodesign practice? Well, the barriers are greed and sloth. I mean, most of us and poverty and war and pestilence. Most of Europe and most of North America and most of South America and most of the advanced economies of the world have the laws and don't follow them. Very few follow them. Very few follow them. That's one. The second is that we're not training people to think this way. Look, we've got students who are worried about their first job for a private client. We need 10,000 people who are willing to think long-term publicly and not for personal fame. They'll actually do very, very well economically if they can do this kind of work. Very, very well. And we're not teaching collaboratively. Our university systems themselves make it hard to teach collaboratively. How do you grade a student when you don't know who did what in a project? I've done that, and I've told students this in advance, and I've told my university, and I don't grade to a scale, and I give the whole class the same grade, and I'm damned if I'm going to do it the way most universities require. I think the university is at fault, and I think the faculties are at fault for assuming that everything has to be done individually. I've written about that. There's a whole YouTube diatribe on my part on this. So that's my answer to that question. I think the students like it. I've never been short of students, and I've never been in a situation except with I've had 1,000 students, and I've had two. I can tell you two that have been really, really unhappy. But then I may have had many that were unhappy with me, because I don't take any nonsense. I'm good at what I do, but it's serious work that has to be dealt with seriously. You're not there to play basketball. And if you're not interested, then you have lots of other things you could do as a professional. But if you are interested, you need an outlet for it. And I decided this years ago. I decided that when I was going to retire from my teaching, I was going to teach teachers. And what I really think that is happening with the collaboration is that it's changing the teaching of the people who are actually going to be in position to have to do this kind of work. And there'll be a model, and the systems will undoubtedly, the systems will either collapse or they'll adapt to the idea that private enterprise has limits and government has limits. But that if you don't think long-term and systems-oriented, we're all in deep trouble. So I'm a pessimist on one side and an optimist on another side. Okay? In that case, I really say to any of you who are in universities who don't have geodesign, get it as fast as you can, even if it's sub rosa. It's more important than you think. And the first job is not the first important thing for your students. It's the fourth job that they really need to be educated for. Training can be done on the fly. Education can't be.
Well, I think that's a terrific way to close this.
Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
There was a terrific presentation by Carl. We thank him so much for joining us for this Borchert lecture. I think the fact we still have 160 people with us tells us something about the quality of the presentation and the Q&A. We are out of time, so we will move on now. And again, thanks to everybody for joining us today. We had a close to 300 people at one point in time. And thanks again to Carl Steinitz for an invigorating and stimulating lecture. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad that it's been videotaped, and I look forward to seeing it, and I hope it's shared. I'm certainly going to share it among my grandchildren and my colleagues. Good. Thank you for inviting me.